I once sat across from someone conducting a job interview who spent the entire time checking his phone, making occasional eye contact, and then suddenly asking me what my greatest weakness was while looking at his email. Midway through my response about wanting to improve my delegation skills, he interrupted to take a personal call about his dinner plans. He returned and asked me the same question again, clearly having forgotten he'd already asked it. By the end of the 20-minute interview, I wasn't sure if I'd been interviewed or if I'd watched someone do their job poorly. During an interview process, the hearing manager decided to quiz me on extremely specific technical details that had nothing to do with the actual position I was applying for. When I mentioned the position description didn't mention these requirements, she insisted I should just know them because they're common knowledge. She seemed irritated that I hadn't studied computer programming languages for a marketing role. She took notes on my answers while nodding disapprovingly. One interviewer conducted what he called a behavioral assessment by asking me to solve a riddle that made absolutely no sense. The riddle involved three people, a bridge, a flashlight, and some completely arbitrary rules that kept changing as I attempted to solve it. When I asked how this related to project management, he got defensive and said intuition was everything. By the end, he changed the riddle rules so many times that no solution existed. Meeting with an interviewer who apparently thought the position was for something completely different than what the job posting described, she asked me detailed questions about experience I didn't have and seemed baffled when I mentioned my background and what the job actually was. She consulted the job posting with visible confusion, muttering that the requirements must be wrong. Then she tried to match my background to a different position that didn't exist. An HR professional decided interview small talk should involve me discussing my entire medical history, relationship status, and whether I plan to have children soon. When I tried redirecting to the job requirements, she acted offended that I was being evasive. She literally told me that discussing whether I wanted kids was essential to determining if I'd be a good fit. I left early. I encountered someone interviewing me who spent 40 minutes discussing his own professional failures before asking me a single question about my qualifications. He went into excruciating detail about how he'd been fired from 3 companies, each time blaming external circumstances. Then he suddenly asked me a rapid-fire question about sales projections and seemed annoyed when I needed clarification after his rambling monologue. Sitting through an interview where the hearing manager brought her friend along without explanation or introduction. The friend just sat there the entire time, eating snacks, occasionally making comments like "that's weird" about my responses. Neither the manager nor the friend introduced themselves or explained the friend's role. At the end, the friend left and the manager continued like nothing unusual had happened. One interviewer became visibly angry when I mentioned I had another job interview scheduled with a competing company. She acted personally betrayed that I was exploring other options and spent the remaining interview time making comments about my loyalty. She seemed to expect me to commit entirely to her company before knowing the salary, benefits, or actual job duties. She then rejected me and complained to HR about my lack of loyalty. An interviewer I met spent the interview time trying to convince me that my previous job was fake or that I'd misunderstood what I'd been doing there. My resume clearly showed 3 years at a tech company, and she insisted I must have been doing something completely different than what I described. She corrected me repeatedly about my own work experience, explaining to me what I'd actually been doing based on her assumptions. During an interview, the hearing person received a phone call from her mother asking what to make for dinner that night. She took the call, discussed pasta versus chicken for 5 minutes, then returned to the interview acting like nothing had happened. When I glanced at my watch, she accused me of being impatient and more interested in leaving than working. The entire tone shifted because she perceived me checking the time as disrespect. I experienced an interviewer who kept confusing my name with another candidate's name, mixing up details about our backgrounds, and discussing the other candidate's experience as if it were mine. When I corrected her, she insisted I was mistaken about my own resume. She spent 10 minutes arguing that I definitely studied accounting in Portland when my resume clearly said marketing in Denver. She just kept insisting I was remembering incorrectly. An interview situation that was absolutely surreal involved the hearing manager asking me to do the job during the interview to prove I could do it. Not discuss it, not walk through examples, but actually perform the work. She handed me her laptop and asked me to redesign her entire marketing strategy right there while she watched. When I explained I'd need research time and information, she claimed that was making excuses. Meeting with an interviewer who'd clearly not read my resume and was working from outdated job descriptions or someone else's notes. He kept asking about experience I'd never claimed to have and seemed disappointed when I said I didn't have it. He eventually admitted he'd been interviewing the wrong person for the position, but continued the interview anyway. He never did clarify what the actual position was supposed to be. An interviewer decided the best way to assess my confidence was to insult my background repeatedly and watch my reaction. She made comments about my previous employers, my education level, and my work history being unremarkable. When I remained professional and didn't react emotionally, she claimed I lacked passion. When I defended my background, she said I was being defensive. No response was correct because the entire interview was designed to make me fail. During an interview, someone asked me what my salary expectations were. I provided a range. She said that was too much, then offered half what I'd requested. When I declined, she acted shocked that I wouldn't accept less than half my minimum. She spent the remaining interview time explaining how lucky I should feel that she was even interviewing me given my apparent entitlement about compensation. I sat through an interview where the hearing manager kept stopping to explain the company's entire history to me in unnecessary detail. She spent 30 minutes on company founding stories, the CEO's background, and various corporate reorganizations. When actual interview time was up, she'd asked me only 2 questions and seemed irritated that I had so many follow-up questions about the actual job. An interviewer I met with had apparently never conducted interviews before and kept asking me to explain what interview questions meant. She'd read a question that was clearly inappropriate or vague. I'd ask for clarification, and she'd look confused about what clarification I needed. She was reading questions from a script without understanding them herself. She got frustrated with me for needing her to make sense of her own questions. During an interview, the hearing person received notification that she had an appointment somewhere else and started packing her things while still talking to me. She kept glancing at the clock, sighing heavily, and making comments about how she really needed to leave soon. She finished the interview by saying we'd be in touch, but clearly had zero interest in anything I'd said. She literally walked me out while checking her watch. Meeting with an interviewer who was conducting the interview specifically to tell me why I wouldn't be hired before even hearing my qualifications. She explained all the reasons my background wouldn't work, how the company preferred different experience, and why she thought I'd be unhappy there. Then she asked interview questions, but clearly wasn't listening to answers since she'd already decided to reject me. I left wondering why she bothered conducting the interview. An interviewer spent the entire time telling me what the job wasn't rather than what it actually was. She kept emphasizing what I wouldn't be doing, what skills wouldn't be needed, and what responsibilities I wouldn't have. When I asked what I would actually be doing, she got frustrated with me for being pedantic about job requirements. She wanted me to accept a position where she couldn't articulate what the position actually involved. During an interview, the hearing manager decided to share his entire personal business idea with me and ask my opinion on whether he should quit and pursue it instead. He spent 40 minutes describing his startup concept, his financial projections, and his concerns about leaving the current company. Then he suddenly remembered there was a job to discuss and rushed through the rest of the interview. He never even mentioned what the position paid. I experienced an interviewer who kept making wildly inaccurate statements about my industry and correcting me when I tried providing accurate information. She insisted she knew better because she'd read an article about my field once. She kept citing information that was outdated or just wrong, and when I gently corrected her, she acted offended that I was trying to sound smarter than her. She was interviewing me for a position in my field, while confidently stating completely incorrect information. An interview where the hearing person asked me increasingly personal questions that had nothing to do with the job. She wanted to know about my dating history, my family drama, my political opinions, and whether I had any health conditions. When I declined to answer personal questions, she said I was being secretive. She literally tried to interview me as if we were friends discussing life rather than a professional assessing my qualifications. Meeting with an interviewer who kept interrupting my answers to go on tangents about completely unrelated topics. I'd answer a question about my project management experience, and she'd suddenly start talking about her weekend plans, her kids, her thoughts on politics. She'd get frustrated when I tried refocusing on the actual interview, insisting I was being rigid. The interview felt more like an unstructured therapy session than a job interview. An interviewer I met had apparently sent the wrong interview questions to the interview location. The questions were for a completely different position, and we both realized partway through. Instead of starting over with the correct questions, she continued with the wrong ones and seemed annoyed that they didn't make sense for my background. She kept insisting the questions were fine, and I was just not understanding them. During an interview, the hearing manager decided I wasn't qualified because my previous job title didn't exactly match what she was hearing for, despite my actual experience being completely relevant. She spent the interview explaining how job titles matter more than actual experience and skills. When I explained how my background transferred directly to her position, she claimed I was making excuses for not having the exact title she preferred. I sat through an interview where the hearing person was visibly not interested in meeting me from the moment I arrived. She had me wait an extra 40 minutes in the lobby, then rushed through a 15-minute interview while checking her email. She occasionally looked up to ask a question, but clearly wasn't paying attention to answers. At the end, she said she'd be in touch, but the entire thing screamed that I was the wrong candidate from the start. An interviewer decided to conduct the entire interview while she was eating lunch, slurping a drink, and occasionally talking with her mouth full. She offered me no food or drink while she sat across from me eating. Crumbs would fall on her desk while she asked me questions, and I'd watch her wipe them away without pausing her eating. The entire interview smelled like her sandwich, and she seemed completely unbothered by how unprofessional this was. Meeting with an interviewer who kept a running score of my answers like I was competing in a game show. She had a notepad where she was apparently grading my responses, and at one point showed me that I was doing poorly in the organization category. When I asked what that meant or how to improve, she refused to explain the scoring system. She just kept adding marks to her chart while I became increasingly confused. An interview where the hearing manager asked me to commit to working 60-hour weeks without discussing workload, hearing support, or compensation. When I asked about work-life balance, she said the company valued commitment and that complaining about hours showed I lacked dedication. She then mentioned the previous person in this position had quit after 3 months claiming burnout. She genuinely couldn't understand why the burnout was the company's fault rather than the employee being weak. During an interview, The interviewer kept challenging every qualification I mentioned as if I was lying. I'd say I had experience with a software, and she'd say that's unlikely given my timeline. I'd mention a project, and she'd suggest I probably didn't really lead it. She seemed convinced I was fabricating my entire resume while I was literally just describing my work history. Her entire approach assumed I was dishonest unless proven otherwise through confrontation. I experienced an interviewer who conducted the entire interview facing away from me while pretending to work on her computer. She'd ask questions without looking at me, rarely turned around for my answers, and kept typing during the interview. She'd occasionally forget I was there, and I'd have to clear my throat to remind her to ask the next question. At the end, she asked if I had any questions and seemed annoyed when I did. An interviewer told me partway through that they'd already decided to hire someone else, but were required to interview me anyway. She literally explained that I was here because the company had to interview multiple candidates per protocol. Knowing the interview was pointless from the start made the whole thing feel like a waste of time. She still went through the motions, but with zero enthusiasm or actual interest in my qualifications.